Hi everyone, and welcome to my capstone presentation. For the video portion of this project, I don't really want to spend much time reading through my compendium as you can easily navigate the tabs on your own. Instead, I would like to dive further into an illustration that you'll find incorporated into my website that explains the ways in which the gender binary was created and imposed through colonization and how it's linked to other human rights issues. I chose this topic because the rise of disinformation related to sex and gender has become increasingly frustrating for me as someone who lives with, works with, and loves people across the gender spectrum. As a white cis queer woman, I recognize that I do stand in a place of privilege, especially being femme presenting or straight passing. This allows me to experience the world from vantage points where I'm able to navigate spaces in which my trans and gender nonconforming counterparts might not have a voice. I work as a psychotherapist, and I've had the privilege of hearing the stories, challenges, and fears of trans and gender nonconforming folks, but also their triumphs and their joy in living authentically. I've also worked with many cis straight men, including gun violence survivors, people in recovery, and returning citizens. And I felt the weight that they carry from the burden of fitting into what society deems a masculine man. I truly believe that social progress cannot come without dismantling the gender binary. Recently, the political sphere has relied on demonizing marginalized communities, which pushes rhetoric that intentionally causes division and othering. Throughout the course of this program, we've learned about a variety of social justice and human rights issues, and my goal for this project is to illustrate their interconnectedness. So I'm going to share my screen of a chart that I made, and this graph shows how colonialism constructed the gender binary as a form of social control and how that shapes other forms of oppression even today. So at the top layer, you'll see colonialism, which establishes domination through hierarchy and control. European colonial powers imposed new political, social, religious, and cultural systems on indigenous populations across the world. Central to that domination was the creation of rigid hierarchies, and that was their way of maintaining control. This is where the constructs of race and gender were really imposed on people, and that created a binary between the colonizer and those who were colonized, man versus woman, white versus non white, and more. This also defined who they deemed fully human and who was not. And colonial powers justified economic exploitation, cultural erasure, and even physical violence. This logic required a system of categorization, and that gender binary became one of the primary tools. Religion was also a primary tool of colonization, which created a moral hierarchy based on purity. Deviation from the white, heterosexual Christian norm of a family, such as interracial, intercultural, and queer relationships, were considered impure. We hear this language coming back a lot today, where politicians are calling for bringing back traditional family values. They believe that this sounds morally superior and pure, but this statement has a lot of racist, nationalist, and homophobic undertones. The gender binary is a construct of colonization and religion, and it really focuses on the binary of man, woman, masculine, feminine, which is not a natural truth, but instead a colonial construct used to organize power. These categories were moralized and racialized. So men were traditionally linked to rationality and governance, whereas women were linked to domestic forms of servitude and dependence. The binary was weaponized to impose Western social order, and it also was imposed to suppress alternative gender expressions that existed already in Indigenous and non Western societies. It was also used as a weapon of production during slavery, where Black men were forced into physical labor and servitude, while Black women were forced into reproduction for profit. Over time, the gender binary has become a mechanism of discipline, and that governs who can access body autonomy, property, and even humanity. The gender binary exists with racism. The racial hierarchy mirrors the gender hierarchy. So both were built on the logic of dominance and inferiority. Non-white people were often cast as irrational, emotional, hypersexual, which these traits colonists also ascribed to women. Misogyny is really at the root of a lot of these issues as well. It operates as a gendered form of control, which punishes women and other gender nonconforming people who resist those prescribed roles. At the core of misogyny, or actually at the core of homophobia, is misogyny, but homophobia is a subsection of misogyny, which polices gender and sexuality to preserve family control and social reproduction. It's not just fear of or hatred of queer people, it's a structural tool of colonial governance that was designed to enforce heteronormative ideas and that the only way that is normal for the gender expression to exist is through the binary. So they use this to define non-heterosexual love and non-binary identities as deviant. And colonial systems sustained a moral hierarchy that reinforced obedience, family control, and civilized social reproduction. Homosexuality is a threat to the patriarchy as it rejects the binary because it proves that love, intimacy, and family structures can exist outside of patriarchal expectations. The patriarchal order requires the binary to focus on lineage and inheritance, which maintains that power and control over women's bodies, and an erasure of reproduction. Homosexuality removes sex from the function of reproduction, and it shows that sexuality can be more about pleasure, intimacy, and connection rather than simply procreation. So, this really undermines one of the patriarchy's central mechanisms for maintaining social and biological control. It also destabilizes the rigid ideas of masculinity and femininity. So, homosexuality and queerness in particular functions as a way of uh, kind of deconstructing the patriarchal system, where masculinity is defined in opposition to femininity, where men are more dominant and strong, women are more submissive and emotional. In queer relationships, they blur or reject this distinction. So, for example, gay men who display emotional vulnerability or lesbian women who assert independence disrupt that binary model of what men and women should be, and that exposes gender as a social construct rather than a biological destiny. Today, homophobia manifests in policies, religious movements, political rhetoric, and that targets LGBT communities under the guise of protecting children, preserving tradition, or restoring family values. And as I mentioned earlier, this language really echoes methods of colonial control, which has just been rebranded in for modern nationalistic and religious projects. This is all also related to xenophobia, which is the fear or hatred of outsiders based on mechanisms of othering. It constructs immigrants, refugees, and foreigners as a threat to purity, safety, or morality. And it's also often racialized or gendered. For example, foreign women are often hypersexualized, or foreign men are often deemed as dangerous. So the outcome is that this justifies exclusionary immigration policies and more nationalist ideologies. All of this reinforces institutional abuse. So we see this maintained in the system through everyday practices and state structures. Laws codify who has rights, who can marry, who can vote, own property, or even migrate. Laws have historically enforced racial segregation, gender norms, and citizenship exclusion. They also disproportionately criminalize Black and Brown populations, which create further systems of inequality. Prisons and detention centers are a main way that we see this operating today. as a loophole to the 13th Amendment, and it functions as a form of modern day slavery and productivity. We also see this through the construction of borders, which enforce national purity, which police both bodies and belonging through the idea of citizenship. Borders are physical and ideological, which distinguish an us versus them type of mentality. Again, another binary. Religion moralizes the binary, which frames gender roles as a divine order. And religious doctrines often reinforce the patriarchal family structures, as we've discussed earlier. And so condemning that is also often deemed as a sin. We also see this a lot in the media. It shapes cultural narratives that normalize whiteness, masculinity, and heteronormativity. The media reproduces stereotypes and racist tropes. We see this in words like angry Black woman or violent Black man or Muslim terrorist, illegal alien, all tropes that create fear mongering in the general public and internal biases. Also, education is a tool of institutional abuse. It whitewashes history to erase Black and Indigenous perspectives, romanticize slavery and the genocide of Indigenous peoples. And education institutionalizes these hierarchies through the curricula, the language, and even the history. Schools teach what they deem acceptable in regard to gender roles, which erases Indigenous histories and centers Eurocentric worldviews. These layers are all interconnected and they feed into each other. So, as you can see through the arrows, they all continue to reinforce each other. The cyclical system keeps reproducing itself. So, cultural beliefs justify institutional structures, which in turn reinforce those beliefs. In order to dismantle one form of oppression, we must confront the entire matrix, the entire colonial matrix of power, and how race, gender, sexuality, and nationality are all bound together through centuries of control. So I hope you enjoy moving through the rest of my compendium. And I would encourage you to reach out to me if you have any comments, questions, or feedback. Thank you so much for joining.